Of course, hung on every word of the Prime Minister's statement today, and what a disappointment it was to hear him utter no word about the environment or conservation. But I have to say that last year was similar, although last year we did have that little coded section that was entitled Unlocking Resources, where the Prime Minister laid out his plans for mining our Schedule 4 conservation lands and expropriating fresh water in Canterbury for further industry. I think his words were, any drop of water that reached the sea was wasted. So, such a profound understanding of the New Zealand environment and ecology. So it was a disappointment to hear the Prime Minister's statement, and a disappointment that was only deepened, I'm afraid to say, when Kate Wilkinson, the Minister of Conservation, got up to speak and uttered no word in her speech about conservation either. She may well have been under instructions not to show up the Prime Minister's omissions, of course. But sandwiched between those two statements from the Prime Minister last year and this year, we've actually been living through the International Year for Biodiversity. And I guess the idea of that International Year was to celebrate the success of the Rio Declaration. But in fact, the way it's turned out in New Zealand and around the world, it's been more of a requiem for the thousands of species that we have lost and are still losing rapidly. And Sir Lester Brown has talked about this crisis that the world is going through in biodiversity as the sixth great extinction, the last being some 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit the Earth. This one, of course, is caused by the actions of human beings, and he calls it a massive evolutionary setback and a wholesale impoverishment of life on Earth. New Zealand is a biodiversity hotspot, one of the world's treasure chests of unusual and fascinating life forms. Our plants and animals are utterly unique. They're not found anywhere else, and this is one of the reasons that we love species like kiwi, kereroo, kawai, kauri, and all of those others that we work hard to protect. Unfortunately, Sir, New Zealand also has a long record of extinctions, and many of our plants and animals remain now on the verge of extinction. We have a special responsibility to protect the plants and animals that we love. The Department of Conservation has identified some 2,788 species as threatened in New Zealand. That includes all of our frogs and bats, 89% of our reptiles, 65% of our freshwater fish, and 57% of our birds that could disappear forever within our lifetimes. And there are thousands more native species that we simply don't know enough about to know what their level of risk is. For over 100 years, Sir, New Zealanders have been achieving some remarkable successes in conservation against this tide. But right now, only 6% of those threatened species identified as being at risk in New Zealand are actively managed to avoid extinction. The risk to the remaining 94% is acute. It's true that the Wildlife Act does make it an offence to intentionally kill a native animal, and there is some similar protection for some plants. But the major threats to our plants and animals are introduced predators, invasive weeds, and the ongoing loss and disruption of habitat. And so far, we have failed to respond effectively to even one of those factors. Now, I've only been in Parliament for a short time, but I have already witnessed this government take major backward steps in the protection of these native plants and animals that we love. The most horrifying of these was the government's step to cut $54 million from the Department of Conservation's budget over 4 years, which has massive implications. But that's not the only one. National has also cancelled the Community Conservation Fund, a $4 million fund that the Green Party established in conjunction with Labour to fund community involvement in local environmental conservation work. National has closed an important possum control research program based at Invermay, which was close to delivering new forms of possum control. National has failed to move decisively to protect the Mokihinui River from Meridian's proposed 85-metre high dam. National has allowed commercial eeling of the endangered longfin eel, a species that's found nowhere else in the world and is listed by DOC as a threatened species in gradual decline. That's the same status as the great spotted kiwi, the little blue penguin and the rifleman. And the government has issued a new business-focused statement of intent for the Department of Conservation, which has left major questions around the Minister's statutory responsibility to be the primary advocate for the conservation estate, because the statement of intent is entirely about commercial objectives for the department. And the House is about to debate, probably next week, the Regulatory Responsibility Bill, which will tie DOC's hands even further when it comes to issuing businesses with concessions on the conservation estate, DOC losing their statutory responsibility to put the interests of our plants and animals first. So at a time when New Zealand faces arguably the greatest crisis of biodiversity in the history of human habitation, one might have expected the government's priorities to perhaps emphasise a response to these problems, rather than preparing the conservation estate for greater exploitation and further losses. So the Green Party set ourselves up to be the champions for the environment, working alongside committed individuals and organisations right around the country to try and turn this tide on biodiversity loss. One small practical measure has been to launch that $4 million pilot project in conjunction with the government, which I recognise, that aims to protect New Zealand forests and native species with better pest control using resetting traps. If that's successful, it will reduce the costs of pest control and the reliance on poisons. But sir, the most significant work that we are doing, however, is yet to come. I am working on a new members' bill to enhance the protection of our most treasured plants and animals. The United States, Canada and Australia have all passed benchmark legislation to protect and secure their native flora and fauna and the critical habitat that they rely upon. New Zealand, by comparison, lacks similar legislative protection. The Wildlife Act is antiquated and offers no effective legal protection against the biggest threats. And even our native fish are left without legal protection or a plan for their recovery. In the United States, 85% of their threatened species are now covered by a recovery plan. In New Zealand, the comparable figure is the 6% I mentioned. So my bill will amend the Wildlife Act, revising the purpose of the original Act to extend legal protection to all native flora and fauna, including fish. The bill will give effect to the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy. The Minister will be required to develop and implement a thorough and science-based recovery plan for each of these native species that is identified as threatened. Like most New Zealanders, sir, we in the Green Party love this country and all its people. Our environment and our natural heritage are what makes this country unique and precious. And we are committed to doing whatever it takes to protect these features. It's important for its own sake, of course, but also because so much of our economy, everything that we sell on the international stage, is dependent on that clean green image. We set out, sir, to make that clean green image real. No environment, no economy. If we trash the environment, we sabotage our economy. And more importantly, sir, we rob our grandchildren of their birthright. It's another form of borrowing from our grandchildren to pay for short-term profit today, incurring a debt that neither this government nor any government ever will be able to repay.
Honourable John Boscawen.
Thank you.